And we have two guest speakers today. Joining us from the USA is Raylene Gagnon, who's VP of Global Solutions. Raylene has conducted a very global, extensive research and analysis to provide the data today. And John Galvin, who's the Managing Director of Manpower Ireland, will look at the Irish impact of the marketplace. So introduction, I'll keep it very, very brief. Say, keeping pace with workers on the move will be about 20 minutes. Raylene will present those emerging labor market trends. And then John will show the impact of Ireland, the employment outlook and hiring insights for Q1, Q2 in Ireland, which will take about 12 minutes. There will be time for Q&A at the end, we hope. Now, there may be some extra questions that are available. We don't have time. We will respond to all of those because you'll be getting a copy of the recording and we'll respond to any questions that we don't have time to answer. You are all muted, so please leave them muted. It'll help the flow. Any questions that you have, please put them in the chat function or preferably in the Q&A section so that I can monitor those as we go through and hopefully pick out some of the major ones as we go towards concluding the event. So without further ado, I'd like to call on Raylene to introduce those emerging market movements. Thank you, Raylene.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Colin. So as we advance into the presentation, I'd like to start off by taking just a moment to capture how our past year has gone as it relates to workforce trends. So if we advance just a couple of slides to look at the timeline. Yep. So we'll go one more. And what we've tried to do is capture quite a bit in just one quick snapshot. Looking back on this past year, at various times leading up to March, there was a tremendous amount of noise, concern, and some preliminary reaction to what was happening in the world for COVID. Obviously, we had the first full lockdown in March in Ireland. And then as lockdown measures began to restrict further hiring, as individuals were more reluctant to go to on-site jobs and more resistant to changing some of the remote opportunities they may have had today, we saw that pattern sort of repeat itself throughout the course of the year. About mid-year, as markets began to reopen, we did see hiring start to resume quite a bit. And mostly we saw that hiring being driven by hourly workers. So at the time we called them essential personnel. Now, if we look back, we have individuals who've always driven certain portions of our blue-collar workforce, and they represent globally nearly half of the total hiring demand in the marketplace today. Now in Ireland, it's a little bit smaller than the global average, but it is close to 40% of the open opportunities that we see in the market at this time. And in fact, if we compare year over year, having gone through the hiring surge, we are looking at nearly a 90% recovery. So comparing the demand a year ago to at the pre-COVID level to where we sit today, we've resumed close to the same number of job postings that we saw in the market previously. But this took time and it took change on the part of employers because with our hourly workers, we have had to get creative. We had to be more competitive with wages. At times, we had to offer other incentives, bonuses for attendance, stipends for other benefits, to encourage them to hire with us and stay on board, as opposed to taking another opportunity closer to home or that may pay a little bit more money on the dollar. So when we looked at that on the blue collar side, it was very focused on how do we get people in and how do we keep them on board. On the white collar side, it shifted quite a bit more. Our flexibility around hours and access to remote technology, understanding where we had to make concessions around not just remote work, but remote work schedules. We've had an awful lot of increases to paid time off as a part of policy as it relates to our support staff and our resources. And so everyone has had to rethink and re-envision what their workforce should look like in the future, whether it be employees or contractors, on-site or remote. And that's a big part of what we'll be talking about throughout the course of today's session. On the next slide, though, I think we need to dive in and just get a quick snapshot of the demand in Ireland. So I'll hand that one over to John.
Right. Good afternoon, everyone. Good morning, Raylene. I know it's 7 a.m. where you are. It's afternoon here in Ireland. I think it's great to have the perspective of what's happening, globally, and there's a lot of similarities that we've seen in the Irish marketplace. There's been some variances also, and I think we thought it'd be useful just to have a little look back at what the historical hiring perspective has been over the last number of years and what's changed in the last 12 months, specifically related to COVID-19. So the data that we're shown here is from Manpower Group's Employment Outlook survey. And effectively, it's where we ask employers on a quarterly basis what their hiring intentions are, either to increase their headcount or indeed decrease their headcount in the coming quarter. So as you can see on the graph on the left, it's reflecting the last 10 years. And as we come out of the financial crisis, of course, there was flat or negative net employment outlook amongst employers in the marketplace in Ireland. But it steadily moved into positive growth from 2015 to 2019. And then, of course, the significant decline that we saw in hiring intentions throughout 2020. And if we just focus in on the graph on the right, that's the net employment outlook since April last year. And I think to put it into context, it's important to remember the timing of some of these surveys because they're forward-looking. The figure that we see of a net employment outlook of 9 for Q2, that survey was captured in January last year. And at that time, employers didn't really have any significant visibility as to what the impact of COVID was going to have on the Irish marketplace. Of course, as we moved into the year, as you've indicated, Raylene, like it's obviously affected everybody globally, but also locally. And we started to have the restrictions come into play, as you mentioned, in March last year, and that reflected that negative score of -11 for Q3 last year. But optimism started to come in as restrictions eased throughout the summer and into September. And as the year moved on, employers started indicating more positive hiring intentions. And indeed, the figure of +7 for Q1 was captured in the survey of December as employers were very or relatively positive about their employing intentions for Q1. But little did we know what was to happen over the Christmas and into January and the caseloads and the hospitalizations that happened. But just, I think it helps to put some context around those figures. I will come back and go into a little bit more detail into the Q2 figures, but effectively we're moving into a flat period, so of 0 for Q2 2021, which is a decline from Q1. But as I said, I'll focus in on the Q2 figures later on in today's session.
No, I think that's a good point, John, because as we look back over the course of time, looking over 10 years, that blip down in this past year doesn't seem as harrowing as when you just look from the beginning of 2020 and throughout the course of the year where it was just that straight decline. But it's important to remember our workforce dynamics have changed. Because of everything that's going on, there are people who have removed themselves from the workforce, either because they have to care for family members or they are concerned about their own health or the health of their family, so they may not be willing to go out into the workforce. When we look at the blue collar components of the workforce today, the demand has drastically increased. Worldwide, it has tripled since pre-COVID times. And this is predominantly driven by the operations and logistics side, where we've all shifted to this remote shopping and remote support environment. And the demand for warehouse, logistics, transportation resources has increased. Now, when we look specifically in Ireland, it's increased by almost 46% year over year. And when we look across all of the job openings just since January of 2021, there are 20 employers who represent 16% of all of the available jobs in the Irish market and 23% of all of the blue collar jobs in Ireland today. And you could probably guess who a number of those organizations are on that top 20 list. So thinking about how some people have pulled back from the workforce and how concentrated the demand is for certain types of workers, whether they be assemblers or retail or hourly administrative staff, there are a lot of other job options for them at the moment in pockets throughout the country. And competition in many ways has increased. So although we look economically at the job forecast, when it comes to people, we need to fight harder for them now than we may have had to in the past, which means you need to understand where your wage levels need to sit. You need to understand for these types of workers where other facilities they could work at are in proximity to you and what they're paying. You need to understand how easy it is to get a job at those other facilities. So without naming names, I will say that there are some very large global warehouse and distribution organizations supporting e-commerce, and they have simplified their hiring process to take about 15 minutes. Online application, 15 minutes, go through some questions. At the end of those questions, you're hired. Please bring your identification when you show up for your shift. And it is that simple. They have eliminated all filters and all screening requirements to speed the number of candidates through their process. I am not suggesting that you hire everybody who applies. I am suggesting, though, that you evaluate as you look at your hiring and screening process where there may be opportunities to make it easier on the candidates and to help them to get through that process faster, as we're talking about individuals who generally work paycheck to paycheck. So we want to get them paid faster to make them want to work for us, to make them want to stay where we are. So I'll transition quickly to the concept of white collar and what we're seeing from a movement of people across the marketplace. Many of us have seen our workforce shift remotely. Everyone is working out of their home offices, although recently I've seen a few people start to go back, which is nice to see from back office backgrounds. But as we've deployed remotely, people have begun to move. They have begun to move out of highly populated areas, highly concentrated areas, high cost markets, and started to move to more rural areas, whether it be for personal financial reasons or for personal family reasons, or just because. And the reality is we as employers need to know in the future, who will we continue to hire remotely when this is all over? Because those people who we would be hiring are shifting away from our home offices, and they may not be available to come back on site in the future. So we need to know who it is that is pulling themselves out of the on-site job market, and some are already beginning to do that. So as we look at job postings across the marketplace, nearly 15% of them no longer specify a location, which means those employers don't care where they work. Yep, we were on the right side. There you go. So no, they no longer care where these candidates work. So they are not going to expect them in the future to come onto these sites. And as our employers are starting to survey their staff, we are finding that people are not willing to come back full time. On the low end, 5% are saying maybe we'll come back full time. On the high end, maybe 24, 25% of our employees are willing to come back on site in the future. And that may change a little bit from industry to industry and at the individual level, but we as employers need to be data driven in which roles benefit us best in a remote environment versus which do we need to be on site at some point? Because we've seen intense migration increase, and now we need to think about how we turn that to our advantage versus not. And John, I believe that we've seen a lot of this just in the local marketplace as well. So I don't know if you want to touch upon what we've seen in Dublin too.
That's right. Yeah. So like we you know, at the start of maybe 12 months ago, employers and employees like we're seriously considering about what do they do long term. But I think what's happening in the property market, you know, cements the fact that people are making long-term decisions to work remotely. It's no longer a short-term strategy for indeed the employee or the employer, and that's reflected in some of the, you know, occupancy rates that we see in the city centres in Dublin, and some of the other urban locations have reduced significantly due to the working from home or remote culture, and that's specific to renters. And then because of the lack of stock, there's interesting dynamics happening in the property purchasing side of things with the cost of housing in Dublin and other cities pushing new buyers into more affordable areas that they may not have been able to explore in the past, but now that remote working is an option, they can start looking at those areas, to the extent that banks in Ireland are now starting to request evidence from individuals that their employers has consented to work for them to work from home permanently. And I guess, you know, you mentioned employers need to be considering how we engage people, but we can see that the government is starting to capitalize on this with the announcement at the start of the week with, you know, our rural future. It's the government's blueprint to transform rural Ireland, but they're seeing this as an unprecedented opportunity for rural development, with a major focus on attracting remote workers. And I know we'll learn more about the government strategy later on in the year, but very interesting that, you know, the government is putting a major focus on this also.
No, I think you're absolutely right. And as we think about what those implications are to the remote workforce strategy of the future, this is not just something we have to adapt to. I mean, I truly think we should revision what we think about here and see it as an opportunity, because in the past we've been restricted. You know, I've been talking about the talent gap for 10 years now, right? We had a skills gap. We can't find the candidates we need because we were restricted to hiring around our offices. So now, as we track the way people are moving, as people look at remote workforce opportunities as an incentive in itself, we have the opportunity to embrace it. But it's important to use that remote workforce strategy as part of your employer branding. If you've not decided yet whether these positions will remain remote or whether they will have to come back on site, you need to start working on that planning, because individuals that are working for you or contracting for you today, they want to know when, if at all, they'll have to go back to work. And not communicating that timeline to them or committing to them that they can remain remote makes them vulnerable to other recruiters coming in and promising them that somewhere else. So if they've decided they want to work remotely in the future and you've not given them that commitment, then they're vulnerable to turnover and recruitment outside. So being able to focus on which roles you're willing to make that commitment on, look at the performance over the past year. Who performs as well, if not better? Not people, but roles functionally. And look at which ones really have lost some efficiency because they're not on site at least part of the time. Where do you need in-person collaboration? Organize your workforce and your hierarchy and use that as one of the lines, because you want to define clearly, these are remote, these are on site, these are hybrid part-time. Once you know for sure who is going to be remote, that means you can now target lower cost markets where you may have a better pool of talent available to you. It expands your reach. It can be a part of your cost saving strategy. But you do need to think about your existing workforce. If they were working in Dublin and receiving Dublin wages in the past, and they've just now moved out of the city to a lower cost area where perhaps the cost of living is 15% lower, do you then adjust their wages? Because some employers have gone down that path. It works for some and not for others. It can make those people more vulnerable to losing them to recruitment if we adjust their wages too hard. But being aware of what the best practice is within your competition is going to help you to stay competitive as it relates to those types of policies. And then lastly, knowing what hybrid means to your business. It doesn't mean they're on site part-time every week versus at home part-time the rest of the week. It could be a couple of times a month. It could be that a portion of those workers are on site and a portion of them are remote all the time. It could be that you leave it up to your hiring managers for certain roles, and it could be individual choice. You as a company need to decide, what does this framework for return to work and remote workforce optimization look like for you? And these are just some of those considerations, right? So I wanted to sort of throw those out there. And I think we might have a polling question just to see where you're at with this today. So, Colin, did we have a polling question that we can launch?
There is. We're just organising that now.
Okay. And so you should see something pop up momentarily in your chat screen. There we go.
So quickly looking at those questions: A, managing remote workers; B, retaining employees; C, measuring performance; D, hiring on-site workers. E, adjusting wages to be competitive. F, meeting your diversity goals. So the poll has ended. It's submitted and it'll be calculating that now. Please, we should see the results shortly.
Yeah, I'll be curious because each time we ask a question like this, depending on the audience, it sometimes spreads evenly across all of these, and sometimes, frankly, it leans very heavily towards wages or retaining employees. And it looks like we had just a few answers going scattered across. So it looks like we had some pretty even balance between managing our remote workforce, retaining our employees, measuring the performance and adjusting the wages. So only a couple of folks pinged on hiring on-site workers. And I'm curious as to where that sits in conjunction with planning that return to work model, or if it's for organizations who have consistently hired on site throughout the course of this. Because if that's the case, again, we had all of that insight around how you can maintain competitiveness in that particular area. So rest assured, every single person who responded, you are not alone. These are overarching challenges in Ireland, in Europe, across the globe today. And using information that we see in the marketplace and that we have on hand to share with you can help. Seeing where the shifts are occurring and where the benefits may be from one aspect to another. So thank you, Colin. I just wanted to stop in there and then transition just quickly over to one of the tools we've made available to each of you, which is the Total Workforce Index. And so the Total Workforce Index is something that has been made available on an annual basis since 2013. And we track how every country compares across the globe based on the availability of labor, the cost of labor, the regulations that impact that access to talent, productivity measures, and in the past year, we've added an entire set of remote readiness indicators. So to see how various markets compare to one another, on the next slide, you'll see a snapshot of just some of the ways in which we've tracked Ireland in comparison to the region, as well as across the globe. And so when we looked across all of the countries, and this was published in the fall of 2020, based on data halfway through 2020 in this past year, obviously this is only partially impacted by COVID, more impacted by the response and the readiness of the labor market to support remote readiness for global organizations. And you'll see that it ranks first regionally and fourth within the global marketplace as we look across the board at all of those factors I just mentioned. So Ireland may not have the largest workforce out of any country in the world today, but when we add on specific criteria about educational balance, English proficiency for organizations looking to tap into nearshore and offshore and remote talent worldwide, when we add in the migration and the trends towards remote readiness, and we see the ability of individuals from their homes to support these needs, when we looked at the regulatory shifts and the relative cost efficiency of the local marketplace, you'll see a number of statistics here that drive the remote workforce enablement within the Irish market. Again, supporting the opportunity for each of you to hire locally, but reinforcing for you the fact that there's competition beyond those that sit next door. Because visibly across the globe, as other companies are looking to hire within region, a number have in the past 2 years already shifted from the UK to Ireland as a result of Brexit. And now we add on this remote workforce component, and there's additional external pressure that we wanted to highlight. Now imagine if we could take some of these measurements and statistics looking at the cost and availability of talent within the Irish market. So on the next slide, we take this data and we could break this down at a local market level within the various communities across Ireland and start to understand as we think about return to work and remote work options, where can we best leverage and balance the remote workers versus on-site? Where should we be sourcing those remote workers from? Which roles belong in a particular location? And looking at the data at a very localized level to help to use that information to drive the strategies around your return to work or your reopening efforts or the remote workforce optimization. You may have some roles you hire out of country today already. Are they the right ones? And are the reasons still as sound today as they were pre-COVID? Because these trends that we've seen some of them are never going back to the way it was. We are never going to get to a reduced operations and logistics level like we saw pre-COVID. That has increased permanently, though maybe not to this degree. And lastly, from a remote standpoint, more than half of the workforce is going to be remote in the future. We're still at 60% today, and it's only going to adjust somewhat further. We're certainly not going back to the previous models. So I just had a few key takeaways on the next slide before I hand it over to John to dive in a little bit deeper locally. But we cannot stress enough when we think about remote readiness, understanding who can work remotely versus who should, and understanding where you can source that talent from to get the best access and the best cost. How you should manage your remote workforce compensation. Is it based on their skills and where they originated from or where they sit today? And how do you manage those workers? We saw a number of people talking about managing remote workers in that poll. It may require different skills within your people managers. You may need to rethink, how will I identify my high performers and create that next layer of management when those individuals are remote today? Thinking about those HR processes will help you to build that right model. So using not just your internal data, but the external data as well, to incorporate all of these considerations from the marketplace to achieve your hiring objectives, your cultural objectives, using your DE&I strategies to help support some of the remote sourcing. All of this information is available to you and can help to drive success in your hiring strategies. So thank you for letting me chime in here. I don't know if we want to stop for questions now and if there's any that have come in before we dive into the next section.
Yeah, there's a couple of questions come in, Raylene. One of them I think would be good to cover now. The other I'll save till the end. And
Sure.
the question was there any evidence of correlation between countries that ranked high on the Total Workforce Index report and countries bouncing back earlier, in the quarter in terms of economic activity?
No, that's an excellent question. So we track over 200 data points in that index, but all of them are directly driven by the workforce dynamics that we have, the factors that we look at. So COVID case count wasn't a specific data point, but what we did track was the border closures, the child care restrictions, the restrictions on movement. So in Ireland, where people were being restricted into staying in their local markets. We tracked all of those components, but truly what we tracked was the hiring activity, the demand on talent, and what we saw. There was always a connection between concentrated population and case counts as markets were allowed to loosen up a little bit. And those concentrated pockets always represented to the hiring demand to support that local population. So we saw countries in Asia did recover a little bit faster because they had passed COVID through a little bit more quickly than the European market did. But over time, it bounced back 2 or 3 different times. So at the end, it was the access to skills and the demand for those skills that matched and balanced the population that helped them to stay on top.
Good. Okay. Thank you, Raylene.
Yep.
Then we'll move over to John then, please, to talk through the Ireland local outlook.
Yeah, great. So I'll try and be relatively quick. I think what it's great to hear from Raylene on the Total Workforce Index is how high Ireland ranks. That's 76 countries that we go into, 220 odd different data points around those 4 areas that were shown on the screen. And we as a country always believe that we're a country worthwhile investing in. Developing business, employing individuals, be it an Indigenous organization looking to grow your business here locally, or indeed, the likes of the IDA attracting organizations into Ireland. I think that our ranking there, really does position us quite well as a country in terms of, economic growth and talent within our industry and regulations that sit behind, the employment of individuals. So maybe looking closely at Ireland and what the recent outlook looks like. So Manpower Group's Employment Outlook Survey has been conducted quarterly for the last 55 years, and it measures employers' hiring intentions across 45 different countries globally. And the one main question that we ask, and we've asked this time, is how do you anticipate total employment at your location to change in the 3 months that will end of June 21st as compared to the current quarter? So as I've mentioned, it was across 445 different employers. And again, important to note that the timing of this survey was in January. If we move on to the next slide, like what we find is that the overall hiring intentions are predicted to be flat for the 3 months ahead. And I think, you know, what we've seen is businesses in Ireland are certainly very resilient. And despite this fall in outlook quarter on quarter, employers are effectively saying that there's going to be very little change to headcount in the coming quarter. We can see that 85% of employers have indicated that there's indeed no change to their headcount, 8% planning to hire, 5% expecting to reduce headcount. And that figure is seasonally adjusted to give us the flat figure for the next 3 months. But you know, we must be honest, in the short term, the data does reflect the challenging environment that we find ourselves in and the uncertainty of continued lockdowns. I think the message from the government yesterday is positive in the one extent whereby, you know, we will see certain sectors like construction coming back in. It gives, you know, some confidence to people that they're going to be able to move a little bit more freely in a couple of weeks' time than they have done today. Yet we still expect to see more easing of restrictions as the quarter goes ahead. And if we specifically focus in on some of the sectors, you know, throughout the pandemic, we've seen reliance on the services sector, which has created opportunities right across the public sector, but also with Brexit, you know, resulting in additional administrative duties within the likes of the transport sector, meaning that we see that other services sector there being the sector with the most positive forecast for the quarter ahead at 13%. What's also interesting is that Ireland's manufacturing industry continues to show signs of job gains for the quarter, where employers report an outlook of 5%. So this is one of the sectors that was most adversely affected in 2020 with the tight restrictions that come in, seeing production levels almost halt for numerous firms for a range of reasons, including impact on supply chains. However, we've seen the sectors adopt implementing COVID secure measures, and that enables them to get their workforce back in a safe manner and gives them some confidence to start rebuilding for the remainder of 2021. And then maybe finally, just to touch on the challenges that are faced, of course, within the restaurants and hotel sector, where there's continuing challenges and needless to say, they're least optimistic with an outlook of -3%. You know, often coming into the summer period, it's a busy time for hospitality, restaurants and tourism. But with the restrictions remaining in place for those sectors, unfortunately, the challenges will remain as we move into Q2 and indeed Q3. It hasn't been all doom and gloom, as I've touched on. Like, there has been a number of positives, and Raylene touched on this earlier, that like we could see different jobs and changes in the jobs dynamics at a global level. We've seen new roles created here locally as well. I've just mentioned, you know, the public sector and growth in that area. Of course, contract tracers is a skill set that we didn't hear of more than 12 months ago. Numerous organizations have bringing in temperature checkers, be they into healthcare environments or indeed production environments, with, you know, the move to online purchasing, be it, you know, your local weekly shopping or indeed clothes or other online shopping. There's been a bit increase in drivers in the transport sector. MedTech production operatives, we've seen a number of employers increase their headcount, again, as you mentioned, Raylene, temporary headcount as organizations help the fight against COVID. And then as we transition to working remotely, of course, it puts a focus on cybersecurity and the new environment where we're all working. Are we working in a cybersecure space? And that has resulted in an increase in need for some cybersecurity professionals. So, you know, the challenge that organizations have had to face is, do they bring in new resources? Are they temporary resources to cover some of these new roles, or are they long-term positions within organizations? If we move on to the next page, we take.
You know what, John? Can I interject something on that last slide, because I had a couple of questions come in directly to me around managing the remote workforce, And there was a note and a comment you just made on that previous slide, if you could go back for 1 second. And I think it's important as employers that we all look at what the roles and responsibilities of our pre-existing staff have changed into, because with the remote deployment, as certain people have had to take a few weeks off to recover from COVID, or as they've been promoted, others have picked up the slack or added some sort of COVID-related duties to their day-to-day jobs. And when we think about balancing and managing our remote workforce, it isn't just about those people checking the boxes of what they've been asked to do, but also you being aware if you started to ask them to do 3 times more than what they did before. Because we've all developed a habit of working longer hours and not taking the breaks we would have taken in the past. And the burnout on the remote workforce side has started to increase compared to the way it would have been in the past when we were socially involved. You know, this isn't about scheduling Zoom happy hours with your remote workers to keep them engaged and mentally healthy. It's about making sure you're not creating additional responsibilities and pressures for them. So there's lots of technology to measure their performance, but we need to look at how much we've asked them to change that performance given the remote deployment, and understand that they've taken on more in the short term, but they may not take on more in the long term. And those high performers who have taken those bigger roles, they're the ones you don't want to lose. So assessing how those roles have changed is a key strategy. And I just wanted to interject that because a couple of individuals had asked about it on the chat. And so I just wanted to throw that out there.
Yeah, no, I think all really good points. You know, organizations need to be very mindful of the changes that they're asking individuals to do, but also the impact of remote working on them. You know, we hear more and more about employers focusing on wellness, because some people do want to get back into the office and they can't. And like, you know, how is that impacting them? How is the restrictions impacting them? So as you say, it's not only about what are we asking people to do, but how are they coping in general, and how can we support them? And indeed, what training can we give to managers in organizations to support the employees in the business as they transition to a remote working environment? If we very quickly just look at the regional outlook, for Dublin, encouragingly, employers anticipate strong hiring for the coming 3 months, with the most optimistic outlook of +7%. But as we showed there across the rest of the provinces, that they're saying that they're going to experience a contraction. However, you know, I think it's particularly positive to see Dublin coming back to pre-pandemic hiring levels, because what we've seen in the past, going back to the financial crisis, where Dublin hiring bounces back, it tends to trickle down to the rest of the country as well. So, you know, positive outlook for Dublin at the moment, and hopefully that will transition to positive outlook in the regions in the quarters throughout the rest of the year. Very briefly to touch on in the next slide in relation to, you know, company sizes, and again, really, and you mentioned it, at a global level and indeed at the local level, we do see a lot of the employment being associated with a small number of companies, and the survey did show that large organizations with more than 250 employees are forecasting healthy job gains at +22%, whereas medium, small-sized organizations are expecting to contract in the months ahead. And that tends to be associated with, you know, the ability for the larger organizations to invest. They've been least impacted over the last 12 months in Ireland, and indeed, like, a lot of our GDPR in Ireland is associated with, you know, the tech and the life science sector, and a number of big employers in that space. And we've seen recent, you know, job announcements in the media this week with the likes of Intel and Stripe, you know, their intentions to hire hundreds of people. So, you know, it bodes well for the smaller organizations. I think in the longer term, of course, in the short term, it's great that the larger organizations are now committed to investing in people. But I think we should see that trickle into the other organizations, smaller organizations that potentially feed into some of those supply chains, or will be positively impacted by the employment growth with the big companies. I'll very quickly go through some of these, just very mindful of time. So part of our survey to capture what employers are indicating where individuals will work over the next 6 to 12 months. And because some people are a little bit surprised by the fact that, you know, the biggest portion there is associated with workplace. based working. So that's indicating, you know, people are going to be back in the workplace. But to give it some context, you know, be very mindful of the fact that a lot of people do need to go into work. You know, we reference retail. Of course, retail means people are back into shops providing whatever services that they provide. The transport sector, drivers at warehouses, it means people have to be on site, production, etc. So it's almost a small portion of workers, small and maybe potentially 40% of the workforce have the ability to work remotely. So maybe just to give a little bit of context to that slightly greater portion to people that are indicating they'll be back to work, there is some context that sits behind that. If we move on to the next one, this one is pretty much following up on a lot of what Raylene has indicated. You know, we've seen an increase in the temporary workers across the globe, and indeed we've seen that locally in Ireland. The full-time workers have been, I guess, the sector or the worker type that's been most negatively impacted in the last 12 months. However, we're starting to see positive signs of companies prepared to invest in individuals and indeed their businesses, so offering people permanent opportunities where there was a little bit of reluctancy to do that 12 months ago because of the uncertainties in the marketplace. If we move on to the next one. And this was a question, I guess, all employers and indeed people in society are asking about, you know, how will the vaccines impact employer plans? And it's a bit of a mixed bag in a way. You know, a lot of employers have indicated that they won't require employees to be vaccinated. There's a fair portion, you know, about a third indicating that they're undecided, and then the remaining percentage saying that they will plan towards vaccination by highlighting the benefits or indeed offering incentives. Very small proportion of employers indicating that they'll require all employees to be vaccinated. So it's just a bit of an interesting perspective of employers' views in relation to the vaccines. Just to touch on this, what Raylene's already mentioned, you know, the correlation of the outlook versus the total workforce index, and I guess you can see it there at the top of the charts with the likes of Taiwan, a country that imposed strict restrictions, starting to have a significant positive outlook in the quarter ahead, and the US not far behind with, you know, the vaccine rollout. Closer to home there on the left, you can see the United Kingdom has a net employment outlook of -5%, and that is potentially likely to change because of the vaccine rollout that's happening there. But, you know, at the time of the survey, the net employment was -5%, and I think that Brexit partly feeds into that score. I guess if we move on to the last slide, I've raced through those to try and get us to finish up on time. These are just some questions that, you know, as organizations, you need to ask yourself, you know, what of these insights are you going to incorporate into your hiring strategy? Will remote working trends impact on your recruitment and retention strategies? You know, these are key things for organizations to be thinking of as we move into the remainder of the year. I'll hand it back to you, Colin.
Okay, thank you, John. Thank you, Raylene. Very conscious of your time. There's a couple of people have asked a question. I can roll it into one perhaps to finalize, and we will respond to all questions. So to both John and Raylene, what would you say is the key finding in terms of remote working, and what employers really need to be aware of from the TWI report, you know, when it comes to remote working? So to finish up, what is your key takeaway, the key finding?
Yeah, from my perspective, what we found is that organizations can't actually plan long-term from a workforce capacity or resource allocation standpoint, not knowing when people will be returning or who will be returning. And so using the classification, actually taking a look at which roles have performed better this past year, which roles have had a negative impact on productivity or revenue because they were remote or not collaborating, and drawing that line so that you can plan in the future. I'll give it a quick example, and I apologize for the lawn noise happening. It's not me. So every time. So if you have 100 roles within your business today, and 20 of them you decide are permanently remote, you know they perform better remotely. If you know what those roles are and you know what you're paying those people today, and they've all been based in Dublin historically, then for those 20 positions, knowing whether you are planning to hire for seasonal needs later in the summer, or you know that a product launch is coming up, you already know that those 20 roles can be hired remotely, and you can look, where can I access that talent with greater sustainability and lower cost? And you can project the cost savings that you will be able to achieve at that product launch based on that workforce momentum. You will be able to incorporate and support your real estate and your financial team in planning how much real estate do we still need when the next lease renews. You will be able to plan how your resources may rebalance one another as a result of that. If you do not think internally which roles should be remote, not does Joe want to come back to work in the office, or can Joe do his job at home, but does Joe perform better for the business long-term at home? Just because people can work from home doesn't mean they should. So knowing that, and then knowing what are your other options from a remote workforce standpoint. So you can't ignore what's happened this past year, and you will have to hire remotely in the future, but you should do so with data-driven insight and with purpose that aligns to your business. That's my perspective.
Okay, excellent. Thank you, Raylene. John, do you want to add anything to that?
Well, pretty much just to agree with everything that Raylene has said. I think it's very important for organizations to be aware of what workers want in the future, and it's all well and good, you know, offering people the option to work remotely now, but you really need to be making those long-term decisions and incorporating that into what people you need in your organization. If there's specific, you know, niche or in-demand skill sets, how are you going to incorporate that into your recruitment strategy and indeed your retention strategy? Because it's not only about attracting people into your business, but what are you going to do to keep the people that, you know, are adding value to your organization? So for me, it's, you know, just making sure people are taking that away. It's long-term strategy now as opposed to short-term strategy.
Good. Thank you very much. I agree with you. Okay, everybody, thank you very much for your attention. Thank you, Raylene. Thank you, John. As we close out the webinar, you will receive you know, a survey, an evaluation survey. So we'd be very happy to hear your further comments. A few people are just signing off and saying thank you and very helpful. So we will wrap it up at that. And again, thank you very much, everybody.